Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Leese. I'm postdoctoral associate with the Responsible Governance and Sustainable Citizenship Project here at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm delighted to present to you a lecture that's being sponsored by the Department of History and also co-sponsored by the Responsible Governance and Sustainable Citizenship Project. It's fourth lecture in the Ethics of Wealth lecture series this year. And this is also being co-sponsored by the Women's Studies program and the Middle Eastern Studies program too. It is a delight to be able to present to you our speaker for today, Leslie Peirce. She is professor of history, Middle Eastern and Islamic studies at NYU, where she is also the director of the program of Ottoman studies. After receiving her PhD from Princeton, she was a professor at Cornell and Berkeley before going to NYU. And her first book, The Imperial Harem, Women and Sovereignty in the Ottoman Empire, won the Koprulu Prize Best Book Award for 1993 to 1994. Her second book, Morality Tales, Law and Gender in the Ottoman Court of Aintab, won the Koprulu Prize again in 2003, in addition to the Albert Hourani Prize for the Best Book in the Middle Eastern Studies Society. She has published widely on the intersection between gender, culture, ethics, and economic behavior in the Ottoman Empire. And today she's here to give her lecture, Why Was Charitable Giving So Ubiquitous Among the Early Modern Ottomans? And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Leslie Peirce, and if you would all please join me in giving her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Michael. I especially want to thank Michael Leese and Sarah Wolper for bringing me here. I would also like to thank, and I'm going to enumerate them again, the groups that are sponsoring this talk. So I'm really grateful to the Responsible Governance and Sustainable Citizenship Project, the Department of History, I'm from History Department, the Women's Studies Program, and the Middle Eastern Studies minor. And thank you all for coming. I had no idea so many people would be turning out. So before I start, let me say I have a cold, and I have my array of Kleenex and everything down here, so if I stop, just to do that, look the other way. So by way of introduction, By way of introduction to this talk, I wanted to clarify the question that I'm interested in. And it's not why charitable giving existed, but why so many ordinary people engaged in it in the lands of the Ottoman Empire. I should probably get that map up here. There we go. The usual answer to the why of the practice of charity is that it is a key feature of the religions of the empire. As many of us learn, charitable giving is one of the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. There is nothing essentially Islamic about charity. The mandate to take care of the needy, as well as the broader obligation to share wealth, was a common feature of all 3 monotheisms that populated the Ottoman Empire, that is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And presumably some of these habits also came from more ancient civilizations in the region before them. Just to mention one feature that crops up in all of them again and again is the care for widows and orphans, a shared interest. I think when I don't know, but I'm pretty sure, I think an Ottoman city is large enough to have all 3 religious communities represented. I suspect people just took it for granted that everyone did charity. Oh, they probably noticed the differences. Christians, for example, gave more to monasteries if there was a monastery in their vicinity. This is the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there it is. I'm not going to say anything about it. It was pretty widespread. I will take the religious imperative to give for granted in this talk, though I do want to come back to the question of what might be religious in all of this. I want to go beyond that and to ask what it was about everyday life that helped to make giving so ubiquitous. So to put this question another way, what were the elements in how people understood community and how they lived together that made charitable giving an unremarkable thing? I have to say I was really happy to get the invitation to speak on the Ethics of Wealth program. And I want to say that some of what I'm doing here is thinking out loud, Towards the end of the talk, if there's enough time, I'll be talking to you about some of my current research, but I'm sort of reflecting on a lot of things that we know and I've written about. So the principal theme I want to focus on is neighborhood. And what I mean by neighborhood is straightforward. The physical collection of residences, perhaps some shops, and often a house of worship or a space where people worshiped that made up a unit in a city, in a town, or in a large village. Small villages abounded, and they were their own neighborhood, so to speak. So I want to argue that mutual interdependence, reliance on others, and the existence of safety nets, all aspects of charity, charitable giving, have a lot to do with neighborhoods. Among the points I want to make is that neighborhoods were a crucible of reciprocity. Is that actually a word, or do I mean reciprocity? I wrote down reciprocity. I think reciprocity is what I really mean here. That they are where good and bad reputations were forged, and that they were where the preponderance of charitable giving takes place. Not, as you might think, if you know much about Ottoman or Middle Eastern history in general, not in the well-studied large philanthropic foundations established by the wealthy. I want to make the point that it's happening in an everyday way in ordinary places. So we'll come back to those foundations later. Let me just show you one now. This is the first foundation established by the concubine and then wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. We're talking, the dates are up there, of the construction of this over time. She's a very famous, notorious lady, and so I hope I can come back to her later. Anyway, this is a fairly, it is a royal foundation. I mean, she was, the concubine and then the wife of the Sultan, so there's a lot of money here, and it's a large foundation, but not stupendously large. So just to point out the components, this is the mosque. Usually always have a mosque anchoring these large foundations. This is the madrasa, the school of higher learning. Here, you can't see it really well, is a primary school. Over here, it's sort of the pièce de résistance of this, is a soup kitchen. And in the back there, and that was built later, and then in the 1550s, is a hospital. That was very unusual, to have a hospital as a part of your foundation. The primary school, the madrasa, the soup kitchen, were not unusual features for these large, well-funded foundations. So just to say, the period I focus on is the pre-modern, basically 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. I'm doing that because that's what I study, so that's what you're hearing about. And I'm mainly talking about Muslim communities. I think that what I'm saying is not true just of this early modern period. Many of these habits persist today. So I think it's interesting to explore this period because we can see what some of the traditional habits were. Now, before I get into the heart of the paper, I thought I should give you some examples of sort of everyday charitable giving. You will notice that it's not always money that's being given, even though much of the Ottoman Empire was a cash economy in this period, except for remote regions. So these are examples that come from the historical record, largely from court records, that is the records of Ottoman judges' courts. You might, if you have some disposable income, but you're not really wealthy, right? You're not a rich person. You might set up a fund for shoes for poor school children. You might provide the dowry for an orphan girl. It was essential. Well, everybody got married, whether you wanted to or not. And it was essential for dowries to be provided. Normally, the family would do that. If you had a little more money, you might build a fountain, and that's not just, to go get a drink, but that would supply fresh water to people in the community. You might distribute or set up a fund to distribute rice to the poor. Rice is a bit of a luxury during Ramadan, the month of fasting. We know that, but everybody ate at night, so we wanted to have festive at sundown. You wanted to have festive foods if you could. You might make donations, and now I want to come to sort of donations, straight donations to your local mosque, and this comes up a lot. If you're a person of fairly modest means, but you have enough, you might donate the oil that would be, burned for light in the lamps. We see property donations not infrequently. This village fellow gives to his mosque a vineyard. And the purpose of that is so the imam of the mosque can have something to live on. Imams had jobs. Still today, some of them do, so they needed to provide. So he could grow, I don't know, grapes or something, have somebody help him, then he would have the revenue from that. You might donate shares of your house, and I'm going to explain about shares to the mosque. There's a woman who donated her 3/24 of the house, family house, and the reason it's 24th, like 24 karat gold, they do the qira'at, things are divided into 24 shares. I can't tell you how the mosque benefited from 3/24. I think it might be a room in the house that then they could have the rent from. So it's a source of income. And then I'm going to do the last one. This was a source of enormous embarrassment to me as I spoke to an amphitheater, some 200 Berkeley undergraduates, when I told them about the fellow who donated a hoe to his mosque. And I'm saying, now what would the mosque do with a hoe? He rented out to that farmer one night, he rented out to the next farmer the other night, and everybody is cracking up. And one of the students said, hoe, not hoe, hoe. I'm like, okay. But they never forgot. I'm sure they never forgot this whole process here. Okay. Now, let me just stop and say this is equal opportunity gender-wise. Women are giving as much as men, which tells you something. And if you want to explore this in the question and answer, women had disposable property. Okay, they had stuff. Okay, so now let me turn to the main thing I sort of want to talk about, and that is the neighborhood. And I'm going to move to this list here. What I want to do is outline features, and I've listed them here, of the neighborhood that make it more than a shared residential space. And to me, they are, and this was the thinking I did for this talk. I really had to think about this, and it was a great topic to think about. These are features that I think create a matrix, or I would argue create a matrix for sharing, or at least a comfort with exchange. People are used to exchanging. I don't mean to say that neighborhoods were spaces of idyllic harmony. There are lots of quarrels, family quarrels, fisticuffs, people insulting each other. This stuff went on. I do mean to say that cooperation, I would argue that cooperation is the key to prosperity in good times as well as bad, and I hope you can see some of that coming up. Now, instead of using the word neighborhood, I'm just going to use the Arabic, Ottoman, everybody uses this word mahalle. And the only reason I'm using mahalle is not so that you can, I just got tired of writing neighborhood. It's a very long word, and so I just decided to go to mahalle. So when I say mahalle, I mean neighborhood. So the first feature I want to talk about is the mahalle as an administrative unit, and I'm talking about government here. Local government and the big government in Istanbul. You belong to your neighborhood. If you went to court, and people went to court a lot. The Ottomans had, by the 16th century, a quite well-developed legal system with local courts in all the big cities and some of the towns. And in the big cities, there'd be 4 or 5 or 6. I think Cairo had maybe 12 at one point. So if you went to court, this is how you identified in the court record. And I made this up, but it's typical. Aisha, daughter of Ahmet, and Hassan, son of Mehmet, both from the mahalle of Akpınar, came to court, blah, 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 and then we have the litigation here. And I'm just going to make up a scenario for them that they're fighting over the border of a vineyard. People love to have vineyards, okay? This identification in the court record gave you an address, and that address was there in case people needed to come and find you. I mean, it was a very important thing. So your mahalle is where you were from. Taxation is the second thing I want to mention here under administration. Taxation was probably the main administrative intervention of the Ottoman state into local communities. So everybody knew that they had to pay taxes, and that was probably the thing they most thought about when they thought, what do I have to do here? The Ottomans in this period taxed basically in one of two ways. One was what's called a capitation or a poll tax, where they would tax household by household, the male head of household. But another form they often used is a lump sum on the neighborhood. In other words, the leaders of the neighborhood, I mean, they would be informed that this is the sum of taxes, and you apportion the taxes among the residents of your neighborhood. So I think if you have the lump sum taxation going on, you're used to fiscal assessment as a mahalle. And I suppose if you're the guys who organize this, you may, and maybe other people do too, have a sense of the spread of wealth in the neighborhood. This is kind of a sidebar, but I thought I would mention it. The Bulgarian scholar Svetlana Ivanova has argued that when the Ottoman administration switched in Sofia, today still the capital of Bulgaria, to applying lump sum taxation on the Christian community, on the Christian taxpayers, the Christian mahalles, as opposed to the head tax that they had been doing before, that she thinks you can trace the roots of sort of Christian, what do I want to call this, community, and almost sort of political community to this experience. So you can see how the taxation could bring your community together in different kinds of ways. Okay, so I'm moving on to the next unit here, and I want to speak a little bit about the mahalle as the unit of worship. Muslim males are required to pray communally on Friday, which already there gives you a community. Mahalles tended to have their own mosque. I'm putting mosque in quotations because in a minute I want to define what I mean by a mosque. Suleiman the First, Suleiman the Magnificent, issued an order in, I can't remember, it's the 1530s or 1540s, that every neighborhood and every village should have a mosque. This is part of the, we like to call it the Sunnification of the Ottoman Empire, but I won't get into that, where religion is becoming more explicitly a part of Ottoman administration. So whether every neighborhood actually got a mosque, I don't know. So men, you know this, but it bears repeating because I have a point I want to make, that men gathered in rows to pray, you know, row, row, row. And I think it is not, I don't mean to be irreverent here, but I want to point this out. I think it's not too hard to assess a person's economic state by his clothing. As you're praying, you're looking at somebody's socks and the seat of his pants. Excuse me. I also wonder, and this is just, I wonder if prayer configuration, who lines up where in a large communal prayer setting, if a class hierarchy is manifest. There are other issues about who should sit in what row, which makes me think this might happen, and whether the wealthier or the higher ranking people or the people of status in the neighborhood would go to the front row. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just a speculation. Whether this kind of spatial sorting happened with women is harder to say. I can say that if the mosque was, in fact, a pretty substantial structure, it could be a center for encounter in another way, and that is women would be tasked, women and girls, tasked with fetching water for the house and for the home. And if there was a good fountain, the ablutions fountain, I mean, there is some water to be had in every mosque, and whether that would bring them together, I think it might. There's some evidence that it did in larger settings. And I also wonder that if there were wealthy people in the community, and I will say more about why there would probably be in a neighborhood, whether wealthier people would send their servants, so you kind of knew who was who. So just briefly, for Muslims, the mosque is not always a standalone structure. I have to say, one day in a class in Berkeley, it was upper division lecture class, and the student puts up her hand. The first she says, "What's a mosque?" And I'm like, uh-oh. And I realized she had a really good question there. What does it take to actually be a mosque? And that's what she meant. We figured that out later. It could be very much, it could just be a room somewhere. So the visual image you have of a mosque is not what it always was. Though if you had a real mosque with a courtyard and nice water, it certainly would be a matter of civic pride, of neighborhood pride. I'll just make a very brief comment about Christian Orthodox churches, which were fairly plentiful. With their icons, these are Eastern Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, mostly, almost predominantly. Their icons, as well as communal celebrations, were certainly a draw. I just say something about regarding Jewish worship. We know less about the physical sites, and I had to do some polling among friends to figure this out. But it is clear that the prayer community was contiguous with the neighborhood. Prayer communities were often named for the geographical origins of the Jewish community. And remember here that there is really large Sephardic Jewish migration from the Iberian Peninsula when Jews are expelled and the Inquisition takes place. When members of the, and this is from Halil Analgic for anybody who knows him, who knows all about taxes and data, when members of a Jewish prayer community, a neighborhood would move elsewhere, the government would still expect them to be part of the taxation community. You know, they're a prayer community, but they're also a taxation community. So a point I want to underline here is the closeness of the Mahalleh as an administrative unit and then with the prayer unit. I'm moving on to the next aspect of neighborhood now, and this is as a legal unit. The neighborhood is a legal unit. This is very important, very important. And everybody sort of knows this and talks about it. The Mahalleh was responsible for the conduct of its residents, but the Mahalleh is the sum of its residents, so we're talking about self-policing here. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of how this works. If there is a murder, and this is most illustrated in villages, if a murder takes place in a village, the village collectively is responsible for finding the murderer. If not, they pay the indemnity, they pay the blood money, so to speak, to the family of the victim. On the other side, if the people of a neighborhood or a village suspect that there's some criminal activity going on, they have the right, and they often do it, to petition, and they would go to the court, the local court, or they would petition the governor, to petition for the expulsion of the lawbreaker. The most frequent things that pop up here are people of the neighborhood using their home as a tavern. I mean, Muslims are not supposed to drink, but it happened. And so people would do it at home, assuming nobody would know about it, because if they went to a Christian tavern, people would know about it. And the second thing is sort of using the home, using the home for prostitution. Okay? I should point out the pimps in this period were mostly women. As we know, women know women. I don't want to say mostly, but largely. So the point I want to make here about this legal unit are the right and responsibility of the neighborhood. It's charged with, I'm just repeating, with the collective policing of its own morals. The neighborhood has that charge. Individuals living in proximity to the illicit activity could be tainted by someone else's unethical behavior. And I'm going to give you an example of this. It's going to take me a minute to explain this, but it was just wonderful for me to find. It was a case of a female teacher who was teaching other women. And the court record makes very clear that it's girls, new brides, and women. So she's got a large group here. She's a middle-class woman at best. She lives in a configuration where there's a courtyard, but different families or different homes are around it. That's not ideal. Ideal is to have your own courtyard. They're probably sharing a toilet and water and whatever. So she's a poor and middle-class lady. What happens is that, so these women are coming to her house, and she has hired a teacher-preacher. He's teaching them about Islamic morals, Muslim morals, and he brings an assistant. 3 men from this courtyard go to court and allege that she's teaching a subversive religious doctrine. For those of you who know about the Safavids, this is the propaganda, the Safavid propaganda. So she's accused of being a kuzulbash, if that means anything to any of you. And the accusation, the crime here, is that she mixes male and female. And that's the hook on which she's going to be punished, because that's a very bad thing to do, to bring men and women together in an illicit kind of circumstance. And she is banished from the town. And at first you think, why couldn't those neighbors just leave her alone? But their reputation's at stake because they live in that kind of a community, and they're pretty soon going to be labeled heretics themselves if they don't act. Okay, moving on. Another aspect of legal identity, this also is very important, is witnessing, and I've called it the testimonial unit here. The bedrock of the practice of law, I'm jumping up and down saying this is really important, was witnessing. Without the testimony of witnesses, litigation could not go forward. Things that you might do is provide corroborating statements for allegations that are made. I'm thinking, you know, Hassan is having a property dispute with somebody, and so his witness comes and says, yes, Hassan has owned this property for 20 years. I've known him for 20 years. It's Hassan's property. So that's a way of witnessing. I just, to make this a little relevant, want to give you another example, and this is from a court record where Raqqa, right here, and think of this is Gaziantep. Today's Gaziantep. It was Ain Tap back in the day. I wrote a book about it. Raqqa is the headquarters of ISIS, okay? And Gaziantep, which is the sixth largest, this is a little modern news, which is the sixth largest city in Turkey, is now the headquarters of the Free Syrian Army, and all kinds of people have established their consulates or representatives there because it's right on the front line. The border with Syria is right here. Anyway, the reason I tell you that is the degree to which people would go to get their witnesses. This fellow in Raqqa has had a donkey go missing. And so somehow he thinks it's in Antep, or he thinks the Antep people can find his donkey. And actually, he doesn't have his witnesses. He goes back home, and he gets his witnesses as he comes back. And this happens a lot. You're like, why do they care so much about their animals that they will do this? But people always go. So he had to go get his witnesses because he had no case without the witnesses. Okay. The second thing, I think I'm going to go through this pretty fast, is character witnessing. And I call this a pre-criminal record, and I'm just going to give you one example here. This Mizid is a guy. He accuses Husniya, who's a woman, of climbing into his bed when he's staying in the house of her and her husband, right? And that's an accusation of adultery. I mean, a woman climbing into a man's bed is adultery, so women could be accused of adultery. And so what the court does, it goes and it needs a character witness. It needs to find out what Husniya is like. And so what they do is poll 3 guys in the neighborhood, and they say, quote unquote, we have never known any illicit conduct on her part, and we cannot say she is prone to bad behavior. Husniya is off the hook here. Mizid now will pay, this is a little fine point, he will now pay a fine for false accusation of adultery. So, you know, character witnessing. So my point here with testimonials, I'm going to go back to my list, is that people were charged with paying attention to what happened on their streets. I mean, they are maintaining awareness of each other's moral conduct. And they need to be careful of their own conduct because they know people are watching. It's like the legal process, or maybe it isn't even a legal process, just communal process, asks you to be a busybody. Is mandated to be a busybody, and the art isn't doing it discreetly, I think, so you don't alienate your neighbors. I want to come now to economic unit. I think this is pretty straightforward, and I don't want to stress it as much as I did administrative, legal, and testimonial, because I think those are really key. Just to point out that some mahalles had their own markets, a few shops, unless they were a central city neighborhood, and then they had youth markets. Even if not, they're trading with people in their mahalle informally. People's homes could include a workshop. You know, often your home was your workplace. I'm thinking of a cobbler. You know, you just take your shoes across to the cobbler. A seamstress, maybe a woman who's very well known for her excellent embroidery. You might have a periodic market. The Tuesday market would be in your mahalle, the Saturday market would be somewhere else. In other words, your mahalle, the point I want to make, might be a site of material and monetary exchange in an everyday kind of fashion. More important, and this is another thing that I think is really significant, is more important in creating a sense of economic community is this web of borrowing and lending that seems to have been ubiquitous. There were no banks. Sizable towns might have a kind of designated banker. They are called sarafs, but they were for rich people. I cannot overestimate to you the everyday borrowing and lending. People are small sums, big sum, okay? Court registers abound in records of how much was borrowed, how much, when the payment would be due, and if it was a fairly large loan, what the surety was, what the guarantee was. If I don't pay you back, you can have my vineyard. Those are the scrupulous people who went to court and had their transaction registered. I think that there must be many more, these sort of informal transactions that take place on the street, maybe within the family. I do wonder, though, with this penchant for knowing you might need a witness, is if you carried that kind, even that kind of an informal, this I'm just speculating, transaction out, you would do it in front of somebody, so if something went wrong, you'd have a witness. I don't know if anyone has linked this economy of lending with charity. but it's a speculation. The obvious point here is that people seem to look locally when they needed financial help. Conversely, you could gain if you lent money to people. The area in which I work does not forbid interest. I mean, you may be familiar with the Islamic prohibition on interest. There are ways to creatively gain reward for lending or gain profit on lending. The last, is this my last one? Yes. My last is social ceremonial unit. I didn't know what to call this, and my points here aren't quite as collected, or the argument isn't quite as straightforward as the other units I've been looking at, but I thought I needed to say it. One thing I would mention, and I won't go into detail because it's probably universally true, is that neighborhoods were sites of frequent visiting. It's a universal phenomenon. Families might even form part of the neighborhood. People don't tend to move away from each other. And my son lives in Austin, Texas. I wish we all lived in some little community. It doesn't happen nowadays, right? What strengthens it for our time and place among Muslim communities is this sense of women shouldn't be going out in public a whole lot. So women go sashaying around the town, and they would stay in their communities, I think. Celebrations like weddings, the two major Muslim holidays, even deaths, involve distribution of edibles. In the case of a wedding, sherbets, everybody loved fruit-flavored drinks, sweets, and particularly the one, but both of the major Muslim holidays, meat would be distributed to the poor. So festivities are often a moment in which people thought to give food. I want to mention other customs, or just an example of other customs, and these are, I don't even know if I've seen them written about, but they happen. And I asked, actually, a friend of mine about this 2 nights before I came. I said, I want you to tell me about stuff that your family did. She's a big deal at the Stern School of Business, and she works on choice theory. So it was really interesting to talk to her about choices people made, about charitable giving. Anyway, she told me, and I wasn't familiar with this from the 2 Turkish families I have lived among, is that when a man dies, and this was done for her father, the shoes are placed outside the threshold to the house in the thought that they shouldn't go to waste. Nothing should go to waste, and that somebody who needed a decent pair of shoes would pick up the shoes. I want to introduce a concept here, or a kind of yes, I guess it's a concept, and it's called sevap in Turkish, S-E-V-A-P. Sevap is reward, heavenly reward for doing good deeds. Okay? I was teaching this once, and this is at NYU, and my TA, who's Muslim, and grew up in the United States, I was struggling with sevap. She says, I think we should just call it brownie points in heaven. And I'm like, okay, good, thank you, brownie points in heaven. So we had it. So one of the families that I lived with, you're not supposed to throw bread away, okay? So you give it to birds, and people would say, sevap, that's sevap. It's good to do that. So there's this consciousness that some of these things you do are good. I don't know if people are thinking, my heavenly reward, or if it's just a habit to say sevap. As my friend said, well, that's sevap, to put the shoes out. It's a good thing to do. So I think that concept of even the smallest acts of giving something, I'm not saying that people were conscious about, I think I just said that, is that, let me do those shoes because, but that it seems to be a very common way of sort of grouping small acts of giving. The last thing I want to say, and as I said, these are sort of jumbled points here about neighborhoods, is we think that in this early modern period that many, a sizable number, I don't want to say many or most, neighborhoods were not stratified economically. In other words, you didn't have a city neighborhood like the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where you would have very expensive homes and wealthy people, and a poorer neighborhood here. The vision we have is often a wealthy household will be, in a mixed neighborhood. And the point I want to raise here is the circulation of wealth. Is that, that household has more to give during the weddings, more sort of stuff to give, more sense perhaps of what they should be doing for their own neighborhood. In the 19th century, in the later 19th century, this is an example from Istanbul, is that there was a critique in literature literary critique of people, of sort of rich and snobby people who wanted to move up to the suburbs on the Bosphorus. The Bosphorus is absolutely spectacularly gorgeous, and rich people, built houses there. And the critique was that that destroyed, it sort of broke the cycle. I mean, nobody was using the word circulation of wealth, but the sense that they shouldn't do that, that they should stay right where they were, because that was a good thing for them to be there with their community. So those are the mixed things I wanted to say about kind of social, ceremonial giving that isn't exactly charity. So let me now kind of sum up. I'm not going to do a big sum up, but just say a few things about the ethics of, I don't want to call it the ethics of wealth because it's a little broader than that in the Mahalle. When the Mahalle is operating ideally, there is familiarity with goods and money going back and forth. Exchange is a habit in many of the different ways that I spoke about. Another habit is the monitoring of morals. Everyone seems to be keeping an eye out. I can't connect the dots here, maybe you can. I was trying to think, how can I connect the dots between watching to make sure everybody is well behaved to actually giving charity? I don't think I can do that, but maybe there is a way to think about those two things together. Reputation is critical. I wanted to say much more to you about reputation, but I don't have time. Honor, we talk a lot about honor in Middle Eastern societies. Honor is reputation. Honor is your local reputation, and people fight to defend that. I don't have time to give you an example, so you can ask me in the Q&A if you want to hear about how women protect their honor. And you can improve your reputation. That's very obvious. You can improve your reputation by giving. People will notice that. If you go out there and build that fountain, they're going to know, because that fountain's going to be called Ahmet Bey's, fountain, or Fatima Hanım's fountain. People are going to know who built that fountain. I don't know if we can go so far as to say that there's an ethic of, I'm going to call it reciprocity here. If there's an ethic of reciprocity, you can decide that. But there certainly seems to be a habit of reliance on each other. I wrote here I should do a gender check, but I don't think I need to do that. I hope it's come across that, women are witnesses. I'm not going to do that. So I've sort of been avoiding, now I'm going to change gears here a little bit. I've sort of been avoiding the religious, the specifically religious impulse in charitable giving, but I don't want to leave it out because it's quite there. I've been emphasizing other habits that may be conducive to people finding charitable giving natural. The giver probably knows at some level that giving is a good thing in God's eyes, even though they may not be thinking overtly about sevap. It's not always a conscious thought. But certainly that knowledge is there, that it is mandated for Muslims to give, okay? People often gave to their mosque or to the support of the mosque personnel, which shows you that when they're planning on what they're going to do with their disposable income, they do think of their mosque. Faith-related donations, I guess is what I would call that. And I'm just repeating what I just told you. Reputation can be won by generosity, patronage of religious causes. And although it also has a very worldly component. I do this and people are going to think well of me. So that was just a very short reminder that there is a religious component here and people may be thinking about it. Now, however, I want to qualify that, and I think it's time to point out that we live in a world that makes distinctions between the religious and the secular, or the religious and the worldly, while ordinary people in pre-modern times, I think, did not do that. I'm just going to leave it at that. I have more things to say about that, and you can ask me more about it. That's why I think, when we ask why people are so prone to give, it's important to consider these aspects of everyday life that don't look religious. I think there's probably a continuum here of, have ingrained habits, and then, there is a religious component. I also now want to raise a different point. I think it's time also for us to think about receivers of charity and ask whether people were prone to receive in the same way that they seem to be, sort of prone to give. And I don't have definitive answers about this. I can only suggest a couple of things. It's not a topic that I have studied or thought about deeply, but I have in the context of this talk. And my first evidence about the giver, the receiver, is anecdotal. It's not paper research. It comes from traveling with colleagues. And one of those colleagues is Amy Singer, person I was in graduate school with, who has gone on to write 2 books about charity. She's probably the person that has written most about charity in a readable and accessible way for the Ottoman, also more broadly. One book is on Ottoman giving, and another book is on charity in Islam. The other person I traveled with is Sarah Wolper, your colleague and teacher. When Amy and I, Sarah will remember that. Yes. When Amy and I share an interest in the great foundations built by the Ottomans, it's not that Sarah isn't interested, but Amy are especially interested in the Ottomans, and we're talking like Harem Sultan, the foundation I showed you, women build not as big and not as spectacularly as men, but women are constant, royal women, elite women are constant builders. So we were visiting the hospital of the Sultan Bayezid II, we're talking like 1500 here in Adrianople, Edirne, and we weren't thinking a lot about charity, and Amy was just beginning to. We were told about invisible charity. And this was sort of, I think they just told us generally, how people would leave money or edibles in kind of a spot from which the poor could retrieve them. In Gaziantep, which I showed you on the map, it's also my Peace Corps town. Did I say that already? My Peace Corps town. I was there and people told me about wooden boxes. This is recent in their living memory, that I envision these sort of wooden boxes with flaps on 2 sides, that you could put the money or you could put the meat. I hope somebody picked it up fast or whatever you want to put in there, and people could take it from the other side. This, and they emphasize this is not about shame. This is not about, the giver giving something to the recipient, because shame is not a part of being poor and receiving. This is the point they wanted to tell us. And that ultimately God is the giver. So there could be that aspect of it, that you, the giver, are putting the thing in, the object in, and the person is taking it, but God is a part of this whole process. When Sarah and I were traveling, and you correct me if I've got this all wrong, we were traveling in Konya, a very old city with a lot of monuments. And we went to see this medieval foundation. Have you taught this in your classes? Do your students know about this? Okay, we went to see this medieval foundation. It was out on the edge of town. Neither of us knew what we were doing, but there we went and we found it. And it was really fantastic because there was this terrific groundskeeper who wanted to tell us all these stories. This is the way things go. You find a place and the local lore is right there. Whether it's all true or not, but you just hear, you get stuff, local pride, you hear all this. And he basically told us that this part of the portal, can you see where that is? Here. Oh, the truck is in front of it, you can't see it. Kind of was like a charitable dispensary. And I don't know if it's true or not, but he told us that, in here, there's kind of a receptacle inside, and people put food there. And then he told us, and this seems a little not quite believable, is that this is sort of a basin, and people would put sherbet in there, or maybe not, and then you could pull the cork and get it out here. I don't know if that's true. How did she believe that? But he believed that that was true. And next one is where he's showing us how you put your hand in and get the money out or whatever you left there. So this is living lore. True or not, we don't know. So I think the next point I want to add, just for purposes of completion here, is about the naturalness of receiving, and perhaps even a sense of entitlement. I think this portal that I just showed you, if we want to keep circulation of wealth in mind, is certainly a vehicle for doing this. Giving and receiving can be part of this circle of giving, and if God is there, it's a very broad circle, a circular process altogether. So going back to receiver, this is probably the most important verse in the Quran about what constitutes alms. And alms they're not just for the poor. And this is sort of the point I want to make, is there's a broader range of people who are entitled to receive. And they include some very high power people here. The poor, the indigent, number one, number two. For those who work to administer alms, that means the functionaries who are collecting the alms and distributing them. In other words, people who are in the business of, I don't know, charitable foundation giving. For those whose hearts are to be won over. That's interpreted to mean converts. It's always good to have somebody convert to Islam if you're a Muslim and you're in a Muslim community. And this was to welcome them, we think, or this is an example, to welcome them into the new religious community with a gift of clothing, with a gift of appropriate clothing and possibly some money. That may be a modern, there's always an interpretation of what this means. For those in bondage, maybe for the release of slaves, but it may also be for prisoners of war. Prisoners of war and ransoming of prisoners of war is an enormous phenomenon. There are all kinds of Christian associations that are charitable ransoming associations, the Mercedarians among them. For debtors, it's good to help debtors and allow them to get back to their family. Prisons were for debtors. People were not imprisoned on the whole, but there were debtors' prisons. So it's a good thing to get a debtor back and helping his family. For those who are in the cause of God, this is a very large category of people, and it's taken to mean all the people whose professions are sort of religious, imams, muftis, qadis, judges, all people who are sort of in jobs, priests, like seminaries. That's a very large category of people. And some of those people are very high-ranking. They would be wealthy people themselves. But the point is, it's the responsibility of the community to support the religious infrastructure, so to speak. And for wayfarers, meaning travelers. So there's a whole host of people. And the poor and the indigent meaning very poor. That's what we think they mean here, the poor and the really poor. That I'm wondering if you are poor and you're an object of charity, if you have that some sense of the broader realm of people who are objects of charity. In other words, you're only one point. It's not just about poverty. So that, the people who are in the cause of God are definitely entitled. So whether that would translate out into the actual giving of charity to the poor and the indigent, I just wanted to raise that. So I think of all of these possibilities, though, if we go back to the neighborhood, certainly the first two are the most accessible. And I hope I've convinced you that there are ways of giving on a daily basis, on a very routine basis, and also doing it in a more explicit way for your neighborhood or your community. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here and take a time check. I think I should. I'm sorry? Okay, so I thought, this is my own current research, and this is kind of the sexy part of the talk, because it's literally kind of sexy, and I will go through it very fast, and you can ask me questions, is to go back to the foundation of Harem Sultan. I don't know how many of you are watching this TV show. It's just been a worldwide phenomenon. It's the history of Suleiman the Magnificent and Harem, and apparently 150 million people have been watching this. It's been over for a year and a half now, and translated into, or dubbed into 52 languages. So the story of this sultan and this woman has now become very big. I'm writing a biography of her, which seems like a really terrifying thing to do. But one of the things, she's notorious because they say she seduced him, bewitched him, gave him potions, and that's why he did all the bad things he had to do in his reign. Sultans have to take some pretty extreme measures. And nobody ever talks about her charity, because I imagine charity is boring to put into these shows. They do give you occasional, sense that she's building something out there, but Suleiman's the one who gets to see the architectural model. I know damn well this woman had something to do with this. I'm sure she knew what she wanted there. So I've actually written 2 chapters about her charitable work, and the first is on this foundation that I showed you earlier. And so I'm going to talk about her charity a little bit here. And just to show you a different shot, no, I think I'm going to go to this, straight to this, which is the, can you see that clearly? Sort of the recreation of what it looked like when it was built. If you were looking at the mosque carefully, you would see that it had 2 domes, That was later. The congregation of this neighborhood grew, and so in the 17th century, the mosque was expanded. So the first thing she builds is the primary school here. It was a fancy primary school in the sense that it had an indoor and outdoor, so when the nice weather came, the kids could go outdoors. If they lived in New Hampshire, which they didn't, they lived elsewhere, they could go indoors when the snow was just piling up. And I suppose the shape of that roof might have had something to do with it. I've been reading all about your roofs falling in here. So that was quite a nice primary school. The madrasa is a sort of ordinary royal madrasa. It's not too big, it's not too small. The soup kitchen is memorable. It's very, very large for a soup kitchen. A lot of money and design went into that. That was all it was in the beginning. I should say that the mosque is modest. The mosque is very modest. Her daughter, her and Suleiman's daughter, would go on to build 2 huge foundations of her own with very large mosques. This woman was a Christian woman enslaved, made a concubine. She's not of royal blood, but because of the exalted station she has in being the mother of princes and princesses, she builds. But she cannot build a great big mosque because she's a slave, an ex-slave. The hospital comes later, and the hospital comes when Suleiman is building his own enormous, enormous foundation. It's, you know, if you go to Istanbul, you can see it on top of a hill. And he built a hospital, and she's doing the same thing. I'm talking with my colleague, Nuket Varlık, who's, keep your eye on her. She's doing absolutely wonderful work about the history of medicine. She thinks there is a revival of hospitals and interest in hospitals. And I'm like, I think the dates are good here. She knew about this. It wasn't I gave her news. But that this is a project the two of them are thinking about together. Suleiman's mother also built a very big hospital. So that they're thinking together about hospitals here. Just to show you a couple of, I was very lucky to have a tour of the foundation. It was being renovated. This is 2 years ago. It was going to be renovated to be a cultural center. Unfortunately, the government took it over. And it's not going to be a cultural center open to the public, but I'm very glad I got to see it. This is the interior of the madrasa on the top, and this is the hospital that was still being renovated. The hospital had 2 doctors, so each doctor, they had nurses. I don't know if the nurses were female or male. I just don't know. I have to get Nuket to help me with that. And there was also an outpatient clinic 3 days a week. My bottom dollar is women did come to that. Maybe there was a day allotted to women. I think they would have. Okay, I just want to say 4 more minutes. Okay, I want to say something about this, go back to this question of sevap, you know, earning brownie points for yourself in heaven. Every foundation like this has a charter deed. I think, did I have that? It's not here. Wait a minute. There we are. And this is the charter deed for this foundation here. In the charter deed, what you do very briefly is you set out all the sources of income, all the village revenues, all the rentals, everything that's going to support this. And then you set out a whole long enumeration of the people that are going to be employed there. This woman seems to have been very, very picky about the people who are going to work there. And I think there were over 200 people who are employed here. By the way, I should say that these foundations are models, are really great stimuli for urban development and urban redevelopment. They provide all kinds of jobs for people in the neighborhood. They bring the neighborhood services, so that neighborhood is, you know, going to experience some uplift. So throughout her waqfiyah, her charter document, she's constantly talking about, you can read along with me here, the kindness, compassion, sort of in good character all of her employees or her foundation's employees should have. She says about the primary school teacher, I'll read it and you can read along. In addition to possessing firm knowledge of the Quran in the proper form of its recitation, because that's what primary school was largely about, learning to write, learning your Quran, he should treat his young pupils as if they were his own children, and he must not favor one over the other. His apprentice should behave similarly as he takes the children through the recitation of their lessons. I looked at Suleiman's waqfiyah, because he's doing this too, he has a primary school, and you don't see this kind of fussy attention to nice people have to be there. There's a whole lot about the guy who runs the supervisor of the soup kitchen. He has to know how to manage people, so they'll all sit down quietly and do their thing. The doctors went on, and I think I was talking about this at Bard College, and somebody said, this is holistic medicine. She really understands holistic medicine. I'm like, thank you, I'm going to repeat that. So she wants her doctors to be stout-hearted, of noble and generous disposition, good-natured, and untroubled. They must demonstrate with every patient the kindness that they would towards an intimate friend. That's a quote, okay? They should, quote, not utter even the smallest brutal or hateful words, for one harsh word can weigh more heavily on a sick person than the worst of maladies. We all know about this, right? I mean, you want your doctor to have a good bedside manner. And she goes on to say, and that's not really hard, to talk nice. She says, you know, don't give me the excuse that you don't know how to talk nice, because she says, and she's alluding to the Quran mainly here, is that there are many words that are purer than the river of paradise and sweeter than its springs. So you can use some of that language in talking to people. So I think here we see, and I'll just very quickly say, other parts of her charitable endowment let you see that she's never forgotten that she's a slave, because she sets up these funds for slave women. She sets up a fund so that Janissary boys, they are also Christian slaves converted to Islam and in the service of the government, can have haircuts and have hats. So little things like this. So you see her personal touch there. So I just wanted to give you a brief look at a person, ability to put her imprint on what seems to be kind of a standard sort of foundation to build. So I will stop there with her, and thank you. And I'll just leave that up there. Those are all the people who are employed in the soup kitchen. So you can see the kinds of jobs that it created for people in the neighborhood. That's to say nothing of the suppliers.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions for Professor Peirce?
You talked about this a little bit. You said that receiving charity would be something that was natural, but would it be at all shameful? Like, you know, you see beggars when you like travel and you kind of like see people avoiding them. What would the interaction have been then?
I mean, well, in New York and San Francisco, where I used to live, I mean, I don't know if this happens here in Durham. I mean, we have people soliciting, or I don't know what to call them, beggars. It seems to be a very natural phenomenon. So I was thinking about that. Is, you know, have I ever seen shame? And I guess you wouldn't be out there if you didn't. I don't know what that transaction would have looked like. Is that what you're asking me? Can I really imagine? I know that in my ex-husband's family, that routinely, this is an Istanbul apartment building, what do we call them in English? The kapıcı, the doorman, would be given things. And he would be told, not necessarily for you. And the point was, and I even do this with my cleaning lady, who's, you know, from a Hispanic family. I don't know. I mean, I can give you modern evidence. So I imagine maybe there were some words that were used there, so maybe there is a sense of, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
We don't have anybody who writes about this, you know? I mean, there are no records of this. And that's, you know, people were, when I was telling you about the, you know, boxes with two sides, people wanted to be emphatic that it wasn't about shame. So at least people today want to say, you know, that's not here, what's happening here. No.
Oh, okay, I see. So in Islam, it says that when you give with your right hand, your left hand should not know about it. So I was wondering how you're doing with finding evidence for this, given that small interactions are rarely recorded, as you said.
What do you take giving with your left hand doesn't know what your right hand does? What do you take that to mean?
Essentially, the way like I took it is that when you help somebody or when you like do something for somebody, it should not be pronounced. It should just be like a secret thing that you just do because it's sawab.
Or not a gesture filled with I am.
Exactly.
I am. I wonder if these mechanisms of leaving things for people to get comes from that sentiment. I don't know. I also wonder, and I'm translating this, and it may not be the question you're asking me, but when you build a fountain or when you build one of these, you know, you get reputational gain from that. And I wonder if that's, you know, a warning that, you know, this should be done not to beef up your sense of yourself and your community's sense of yourself. Do you think that makes sense? I mean, if your left hand is the sinister hand, I don't want to put a reading on that here, but that, you know, it might not be for the right reason. But the fact that you do it simply and without ostentation seems to me very much a part of what I'm talking about.
I guess my question was more towards how are you finding evidence for the ubiquitous giving during the period? Like, is there like record keepings or
Court records. Court records. All those examples I gave you in the beginning. For the large-scale giving, we have these Waqf documents. We know what the services were. We know how many people were fed in that soup kitchen. We don't have that kind of evidence for everyday interactions and giving. So I'm relying basically on court records. And it's again and again and again. People are coming in. They're giving to this. They're giving to that. They're giving to that. Also, when you start to get literature, I mean, stories in the 19th century will talk this critique of people who are moving away and not participating. There's a whole novel by Holiday Adib on exactly this circulation of wealth story, but that comes up later in different kinds of sources. So.
Going back to what you were saying about self-overseeing for crime and self-governing, because it was such a polyglot population, would it often be a problem that some people would accuse others, maybe that they didn't agree with and didn't like, of certain things? Like, is that something common that you would see maybe throughout the court? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Do I see people accusing other people of doing things? Is that?
Yeah, like, is that, like, because it was such a polyglot community, like, would you see that a little more, like, certain people from different religions accusing other people, or?
No, not in the sources I've looked at. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. I don't study Istanbul. If I studied Istanbul, where communities are living in close proximity, working and moving around, I wonder if we would see more of that. What I see more of is family litigation. I'll give you, I'm sure that happened, but it's not what I see. It may be that those kinds of cross-religious incidents don't come to court. Maybe they don't leave a record. Maybe there's a lot of mediation. I left mediation out of my list. There's a tremendous amount of quasi-formal mediation where people from the two sides, you know, upstanding moral people from the two sides come together and they do what is called sulh, a process of making peace. I'm wondering if those kinds of mechanisms, which don't often get recorded, might be happening. But what I can tell you about, and it doesn't answer the polyglot question, although I'll come at it in one way, is family members accused. I need to tell you about slander. To call somebody all the bad words we know, you whore, you bastard, is to accuse somebody of having had illicit sex, of committing adultery, and it's actionable. Slander is actionable. So there's this woman she's from a very litigious family. Her brother seems awful, and he calls her a whore. She's the lady who sold 3/24 of her house. And she comes to court and says, my brother called me, you know, and she doesn't have witnesses, and she loses the case, but she's gone to court and made the point about her brother, and I'm going to tell you that guy shows up a lot. So I'm trying to think of an example where it might cross socioeconomic bounds. And I want to go back to this woman who was taken to court because of teaching bad doctrine. It's in the same town. And this is a fellow, it doesn't say that he's a follower of this, from the Ottoman point of view, heretical religion. But I can tell from his characteristics and the way he's described in the court that he probably is. And he goes, excuse me my language, but sexual slanders, he goes in front of the shop. The guy must have been if he had a shop in the bazaar, he was somebody. And he calls him how am I going to put this? The passive partner in a male-male relationship. Homosexuality is the wrong word to talk about male-male relationships. Homoerotic is the right word, and there's quite a latitude of acceptance if those kinds of relationships are handled properly. It's usually an older man and a younger boy. To call this adult man who is a shop owner, you know, the passive partner is the worst possible thing you can do. And he does that, and he's called into court, and he is punished. And I'm thinking he is wasting his social capital to get back at this guy. And I can't tell you it fits into this tension. But followers, the woman, the teacher, was of modest means. I am wondering if, you know, it was a kind of a heresy or a faith that was spreading among sort of more modest people. So you see that, and I've seen more of that, where across class lines, and it's a weapon of the weak, it's a weapon of the poor to curse. I wish I could answer that question. It's a great question about interfaith confrontations. They fought over property, but everybody fought over property. I mean, yeah.
Thank you. I guess we study history. One of the reasons is to try to make sense of the present. So if I can just get your thoughts on what's going on right now and whether you think the sentiment of charitable giving is still living on in Turkey, specifically with respect to the present time. There is a revisit of the Ottoman legacy, the Ottoman pride. Even the Arabic characters that they used to use before the Ataturk coup, they're revisiting all this under the current government. And Turkey now feels the sense of pride that they're actually taking care of several millions of Syrian refugees, in contrast to the same refugees living in Lebanon and Jordan actually not getting the fine treatment that they're getting in Turkey. So is that living on? Is that connected also with that history?
I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. I mean, if I say that the impulse to share and give is always there, and it's almost a natural reaction, I would ask that more about how Syrian communities are being treated locally. And that's where I think and I don't know the answer. This is not the question you're asking me, but the practice of large charitable foundations predates the current, I'd say, you know, the great universities that have been established as Waqf institutions, as foundational institutions. I don't know, and maybe you know more than I do, is with the greater openness about religion in Turkey in the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years, are more people establishing local kind of giving mechanisms that I'm talking about? Do we know that that's happening?
They are, my understanding they are, but there is still a lot of government observation and monitoring of what's going on because of the issues.
Because of the issues.
Internally
the tensions,
in Turkey and the tensions there. Yeah.
I mean, but I just do want to emphasize, you know, me living there in the Peace Corps and then later, is how common just this everyday business was. And it wasn't happening in my childhood here. It wasn't happening. And so I think that's what was really made me want to talk about this today, is it seemed really, you don't waste anything. That's a different ethic, that you don't waste anything, but you find a way to recycle it in a way that helps the community. I'm afraid I can't answer your question, because I don't know if things are picking up.
If I may, just one note about what you said, the roles of the prayer, and whether there is anything connecting it with the classes of people or the important significance of people. There is none of that, to my understanding.
Do you think back 500 years there might have been in particular communities?
I don't think so.
I wonder.
I don't believe so, because you go back to the original institution of the prayer. Whoever really comes first, and whoever really cares about being in the first row is the one who really needs to be there. So
I would like to think that it was always egalitarian. I would like to think that.
I don't know. 16th century architecturally, we have special doors that the Ottoman sultans came in through, and the imam and other people of special places might have come. I think it's ubiquitous that it's supposed to be equal, but I think there were certain moments, at least Ottoman architecture shows, where certain people were privileged above others. I mean, certainly today when I go into a mosque, everyone comes in, but if you have these special doors that usually flank the mihrab that are only certain people are allowed, you get a sense that there was a kind of hierarchy.
The sultans never prayed with their community, at least after the period. Yeah.
If it is, it's a violation.
Okay.
The Ottomans violated many things.
That's why I say I would like to think that it was always egalitarian, but you know.
Okay, we have time for one more.
You had mentioned that as far as honor and reputation go, that there was a specific way that women could defend their honor that you didn't want to go into in great depth, but is there a few instances you could describe to us? I'm just curious as to...
I'm thinking sexuality and sexual slander and accusation, that was a big issue and people cared a lot about it. There was rape, okay? I'm going to talk specifically about rape here. And there was rape of boys by men as well, so it's not necessary. You need, if you're going to accuse somebody of any form of sexual misconduct, you need witnesses, okay? And that's a protective thing, so people don't go around saying, you rapist, he raped, but it cuts both ways. And it's very hard to find witnesses. To an act of illicit sex, you technically need 4 witnesses. I'm going to give you, I have time to give you an example, which I cut out of my talk. I was talking about the importance of witnessing. I'm digressing now, and I'm going to come back. There's this young woman. She can't be more than 14 or 15. She's a new bride, and she claims that she's been raped by somebody, and she comes running out of the stable or whatever it was. And the court record says she ran crying, screaming to 3 men and 2 women. Oh, there are your witnesses. 2 women make 1 witness. You're like, did she know this already? Maybe she just run into a crowd of people. Oh my God, look what happened to me. And later, when it comes to litigation, they pick 2 women and 3 men. Okay. So that's not exactly the question you're answering me, but I really wonder if people just have this sense, if something happens, I've got to have people. I've got to have people. Does that point clear to you? Now, if you don't, and I'm going to give you the example here of a woman who lives in Aleppo, if you can remember that map, it's not really close. This is my work in Gaziantep, Aintab. She, like the fellow accusing Husni of climbing into the bed at night, she's maybe a widow. I don't know where the husband or the son is, but this guy comes into her house, climbs into her house, or enters her house somehow, and he rapes her. But she doesn't have any witnesses. And she comes all the way to the court in Aintab, and she goes in front of the court and she says, this fellow raped me. She has no witnesses. And so she's going to probably have to pay the fine for slander, she has no witnesses, and so she slandered this guy. That happens again and again and again, and jumping to, this is now 30, 40 years old, anthropological research where women will still do this, even though they can't prove. And the point here is that by doing this publicly, you've put a suspicion on this fellow. We don't understand. They have something like a pre-criminal record. If enough people complain about somebody, then the community starts to wonder. And the community, that community lodges all of these accusations. Can you follow me with this, from what I've told you? So I think really women had the guts and the opportunity. The court let them do that. The judge let them come. Nobody tries to shush her up. We don't know what happens to the guy if he already has some kind of a reputation. But I think that's something we see happening where women will stand up for themselves even when they know they're not going to win in court.
I'm assuming that could also help
I
later.
think that that must restore her. If there's scuttlebutt about was she raped? The neighborhood in Aleppo. Her going and doing that is saying I'm standing up here for myself, and I'm saying whether they're going to find me or not. I've said this, and so I take that as really fighting.
And that can contribute with the character witnessing, I imagine, that you were discussing later on. If enough women came forward, then they have some sort of proof that more than one person has come forward about the same person. That might help with that case later on. So
I hope this guy gets it, because I don't like the man in Aintab. This is terrible to say. You shouldn't dislike your historical figures, but he was involved in other stuff. Yeah. So, but she was in Aleppo, and so the people couldn't, she'd have to bring all of her character witnesses. It's not going to go that way, because she's already put herself in jeopardy by making this accusation she can't prove. But she did it, is my point. Yeah.
Okay, well, this has been a terrific lecture and a fantastic discussion. So all of you, please join me in thanking Professor Peirce for her great lecture.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we also have a reception waiting for us in the back, so please join us for that.